A suitcase full of cash landed at her feet in a room 10 times the size of her apartment. The woman across from her, silver hair, rigid posture, cold eyes looked at her like a stain on the marble floor. "Take the money. Get out of my son's life." Marin Shaw didn't look at the suitcase. She looked the woman straight in the eye and pushed it back. She had never heard of the Kessler family. She didn't know that one wrong turn down a dark alley would drag her into a world where money could buy lives but couldn't buy her. If Marin's story moved you, hit like to support us. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you never miss the next story. 6 months ago, the wall clock in the duty room had just struck 2 o'clock in the morning when Marin Shaw hurriedly slipped on her light coat and stepped out through the back gate of St. Michael Hospital. Her 12-hour shift had just ended. Her legs felt unbearably heavy, and the sharp scent of antiseptic still clung to the skin of her hands. The parking lot lay across a narrow alley that ran along the rear wall of the hospital, and Marin cut through it every night out of habit. The alley was empty, the streetlight casting only enough illumination for her to see a few steps ahead. She was walking quickly when she heard a muffled groan, not loud, but enough to make her stop. Marin turned her head toward the corner of the wall. A man was sitting slumped against the brick, his head tilted slightly to one side, his right hand gripping tightly at his left shoulder. His dark tailored suit was soaked through across a wide patch at the shoulder, and his face looked pale beneath the weak light. Marin recognized it immediately as a wound, and not a small one. The instinct of someone who had spent 7 years as a nurse pulled her closer, before her mind had time to weigh the situation. She knelt beside him, set her personal medical kit on the ground, and spoke in the calmest voice she could manage. "Can you hear me? I am a nurse. I am going to call for emergency help for you." The man opened his eyes. They were sharp and alert, in a way that didn't match the condition of his body at that moment. He looked straight at her and spoke, his voice low, but each word clear. "No hospital. You don't need to know why." Marin frowned. In 7 years of practice, she had seen patients refuse hospitalization for all kinds of reasons, from not having insurance to being afraid of needles. But this man was not like any of them. A custom-tailored suit, an expensive watch on his wrist, and the way he said "you don't need to know why," as if he was more accustomed to giving orders than asking for help. She wanted to ask more, but the wound at his shoulder was spreading, the soaked patch on the fabric growing wider. Time would not wait. Marin opened her medical kit, took out gauze, a roll of bandage, and a bottle of antiseptic. She gently pulled his hand away from his shoulder and examined the wound. Deep, but it had not reached the bone. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced precision through the exact steps she had repeated thousands of times in the emergency room. Cleaning, disinfecting, pressing gauze, wrapping the bandage. The man didn't make a single sound throughout the process. He simply watched her work in silence, as though committing each of her movements to memory. When Marin tied the final knot of the bandage, she sat back on her heels and let out a breath. "It is stable for now, but you need proper stitches within a few hours, or the wound will become infected." He gave a slight nod, offering no thanks, asking no name. Just then, headlights swept across the mouth of the alley. A large black sport utility vehicle rolled in, its engine rumbling low, stopping just a few steps away from them. The door opened, and a tall man with broad shoulders and a cold expression stepped out. He looked at the injured man, then at Marin, then back at the injured man. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice urgent but controlled. "Let us go, Beckett," the injured man said, then rose to his feet. He stood slowly, one hand bracing against the wall, but he refused when Beckett moved to help him. He walked toward the vehicle on his own, his back straight, as if the wound in his shoulder were a trivial matter. Before getting into the vehicle, he paused and turned to look at Marin one last time. That look was not gratitude. It felt more like a mark, as if he was committing her to memory. Then the door closed. The sport utility vehicle reversed out of the alley, turned left, and disappeared into the darkness. Marin stood alone in the alley. Her hand still carried the trace of antiseptic, her knees stained with dust from the ground. She looked down at her hands, then toward where the vehicle had vanished. The man had not given his name. He had not explained. He had refused the hospital. And yet, someone had arrived in a black vehicle within minutes to retrieve him, addressing him with the tone of someone accustomed to receiving orders. Marin picked up her medical kit and walked toward the parking lot. Throughout the drive home, she tried not to think about what had just happened, but the man's eyes, and the way he had looked at her before the door closed kept returning to her mind again and again, like a question that didn't have an answer. The black sport utility vehicle came to a stop in the basement of an old building on the south side of Chicago, a place that on any map would appear to be nothing more than an abandoned warehouse. Yet beneath it lay a secure underground chamber, known only to a small circle within the Kessler family. Beckett moved to help Rowan out of the vehicle, but Rowan brushed his hand aside and stepped forward on his own, even though each movement of his left shoulder caused a faint tightening across his face. He lowered himself into the only chair in the concrete room, removed his soaked suit jacket and draped it aside, revealing the bandage the nurse had wrapped only a short while earlier. Beckett opened the medical cabinet mounted on the wall, took out a proper set of instruments, and began removing the old dressing to treat the wound the right way. He stitched with care, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last. "They were Paxton Hale's men," Rowan said, his voice flat, as though he were reciting figures from a financial report. "3 of them waiting along the road near the industrial district. They knew my route." Beckett paused his stitching for a second. "An informant? Or they have been watching long enough," Rowan replied. "Find out, but not now." Beckett resumed his work, silent for a moment, before speaking again. "You need a hospital. That wound is deeper than I thought." "If it gets infected, then what?" Rowan cut in, his eyes locking onto Beckett's. "I go into a hospital, and by morning all of Chicago knows Rowan Kessler is lying in a bed. Paxton will send flowers to the room with a polite wish for recovery, and the 3 families waiting for an opening will already be meeting before my stitches have time to heal. I would rather endure the pain than let anyone catch even the scent of weakness from this house." Beckett said nothing more. He knew when to stop arguing with Rowan Kessler. He tied off the sutures, applied a fresh dressing, then stood and began putting the instruments away. Rowan leaned back into the chair, closing his eyes. The wound throbbed, but the pain in his shoulder was not what occupied his mind. He was thinking about the alley, not the ambush, not Paxton, but the woman who had knelt beside him in the dark. Beckett finished washing his hands and turned back, looking at his employer. "That nurse," he said. "She handled your wound well. Quick, clean, steady hands. Do you want me to take care of anything?" "She saw you." "Take care of what?" Rowan opened his eyes. "She saw an injured man in an alley. She didn't see Rowan Kessler, but she could describe your face. She will not do that." "How do you know?" Rowan was silent for a moment. He looked up at the concrete ceiling, as if searching for a way to express something he was not used to saying aloud. "Because she didn't ask who I was," he said. "She didn't ask my name, what I do, or why I was injured. She just sat down and treated the wound. Then she told me I needed proper stitches." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" Rowan turned to look at him, his eyes still sharp, but his voice slower than usual. "It means that in the 15 years I have lived in this world, everyone I have met wants to know who I am before deciding whether to help me or harm me. Partners, rivals, employees, even those who claim loyalty. All of them need to hear the name Kessler before they act. That woman didn't need to know. She saw someone who needed help, and she helped." Beckett held Rowan's gaze longer than usual. He had been with Rowan since they were both young men just entering the trade, had watched him negotiate with the most dangerous figures in the city without a trace of hesitation, had seen him make decisions so cold that no one in the room dared breathe too loudly, but he had never heard Rowan speak of a stranger in that tone. "Find out about her," Rowan said, his voice returning to its usual form, brief and decisive. "Her name, where she works, where she lives, what her family is like, but don't approach. Don't let her know. Just find out." Beckett nodded. "I will have the information for you before noon tomorrow." Rowan didn't respond. He closed his eyes again, his right hand unconsciously resting over the bandage on his left shoulder, the place where the nurse's hands had touched only hours before. Outside the underground chamber, Chicago remained lit and in motion, as though nothing had happened. But Rowan Kessler, the man half the city feared and the other half wanted to bring down, sat alone in that concrete room, thinking about a night shift nurse whose name he had not even thought to ask. The following afternoon, Marin went to Cook County Hospital to visit Josie. She brought along a cup of strawberry yogurt and a paperback book that Josie had asked her to buy the week before. Josie sat propped up against the pillows on her hospital bed, her hair tied up high, her face still that of a 19-year-old girl, yet her complexion far paler than it should have been for someone her age. She had lived with a congenital heart condition for years, had already endured 2 long hospitalizations, and was now waiting for a major surgery that the doctors said could not be delayed any longer. Maren pulled a chair close to the bed, set the yogurt on the table, and handed her the book. "Is this the one I had to dig through 3 shelves to find?" Josie took the book, her eyes lighting up. "That is the one. Did you find it at the bookstore on Wells Street?" "Yes. The owner still remembers me. He asked why you haven't come by in so long." Josie smiled softly, but the smile faded quickly as she studied her sister's face more closely. "Are you tired?" "No. Last night's shift was normal." Josie tilted her head, looking at Maren with those eyes that always made Maren uneasy, because they seemed to see far too much. "You are a terrible liar," Josie said. "You have dark circles under your eyes, your hands are slightly shaking, and you are trying to smile, but the corners of your mouth will not lift. Do you think I can't see that?" Maren laughed this time, but it was the kind of laugh that came from someone who knew she had been caught. "I just haven't slept much. A few night shifts in a row. I haven't had time to catch up." She said that, and it was not entirely untrue. She was sleep-deprived, but the reason she had stayed awake through the night was not her shift. It was the man's eyes in that dark alley, returning again and again each time she closed her own. She didn't tell Josie about it. Her sister was lying in a hospital bed waiting for surgery, and the last thing she needed was something else to worry about. "Have you been eating properly?" Josie continued, her voice like that of a small mother. "Yes." "You say yes again. Every time you give me a short yes, it means you are hiding something." Maren shook her head and opened the yogurt, handing it to her. "Eat, detective. Asking too many questions isn't good for your heart." Josie took the yogurt but didn't eat right away. She looked down at her hands, her voice growing softer. "This month's hospital bill. How is it?" Maren didn't change her expression. 7 years as a nurse had taught her how to remain composed in any situation, and 7 years as Josie's sister had taught her how to conceal the truth without letting it show. "It is handled. I have spoken with the finance department. They agreed to extend the payment." That was only half the truth. The finance office had agreed to an extension, but the debt was piling onto more debt, and Maren's night shift nurse salary each month only covered 2/3 of the bill. The rest she was still trying to figure out. Josie was quiet for a moment before speaking again, her voice so soft, Maren almost didn't hear it. "Maybe you should ask the doctor to delay the surgery. I can wait. You don't have to carry everything because of me. I don't want to be your burden." Maren placed her hand over Josie's and held it tightly. Her sister's hand was cold, small, and Maren could feel her pulse beating slightly irregular beneath the thin skin of her wrist. She looked straight into her eyes, her voice firm. "Listen to me. You are never a burden. Not now, not ever. You are the reason I go to work every day. The reason I get up every morning, no matter how tired I am. I am not carrying you. I choose to be here because I want to be here. Do you understand?" Josie looked at her, her eyes a little red, but without tears. She gave a small nod, then lowered her head and began to eat the yogurt, saying nothing more. The two of them sat in silence for a while. Maren told a few small stories from the hospital to lighten the air. Josie smiled a couple of times, then began to yawn. The medication was taking effect. Maren pulled the blanket up around her and waited until Josie closed her eyes and drifted off before standing. She stepped out of the room, closed the door gently behind her, and paused in the hallway. Through the small glass window, she looked at her sister lying in the hospital bed, 19 years old, her hair spread across the pillow, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Maren drew in a long breath. She stood there for a few more seconds, then turned and walked down the corridor, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her back straight, her steps even. Anyone who saw her at that moment would have thought she was fine, but inside that coat, her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. 3 days after the night in the alley, Maren was reviewing patient charts at the duty desk when a man walked in. She recognized him immediately, the tall man who had driven the black sport utility vehicle that night. He wore a dark shirt, held a white envelope in his hand, and approached the desk with the air of someone accustomed to doing this sort of thing. "Miss Shaw?" he asked. Maren nodded, a hint of caution in her expression. "My name is Beckett. The man you helped that night sends his thanks, and he asked me to give you this." He placed the envelope on the desk and gently slid it toward her. Maren looked at the envelope, then at Beckett. She opened it. Inside was a thick stack of cash, enough for her to know it was more than 2 months of her salary combined. She looked at the money for exactly 3 seconds, then closed the envelope and pushed it back toward Beckett. "I helped because he needed it, not because of money," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If he wants to thank me, he should stay healthy. That wound needs to be monitored for at least 2 weeks." Beckett looked at her as though she had just said something deeply unusual. He picked up the envelope, gave a short nod, and left without another word. That afternoon, Beckett placed the envelope on Rowan's desk, untouched. She didn't take it. Rowan looked at the envelope, then up at him. "What did she say?" "She said she helped because you needed it, not because of money. Then she told you to monitor the wound for 2 weeks. Rowan said nothing. He turned back to his computer screen, but Beckett noticed that for the next 15 minutes, his employer didn't press a single key. 2 weeks later, St. Michael Hospital received notice that Marin had been selected for the on-call medical team at a large charity event held at the Peninsula Hotel in downtown Chicago. Marin didn't think much of it. She needed the extra hours, and it was a good opportunity. That evening, she wore her medical uniform, carried her emergency kit, and stood in the backstage area with 2 other colleagues. The event was larger than anything she had ever attended. Guests in evening attire, chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling, and on the large sign behind the stage, the words shone clearly: Kessler Community Medical Fund. Primary sponsor, Kessler Corporation. Kessler. The name meant nothing to Marin, until she looked toward the stage and saw the man step out. He wore a dark suit, walked with perfect posture, didn't smile, didn't wave, only gave a slight nod as the entire hall applauded, and Marin recognized him instantly, not because of the suit, not because of the name on the sign, but because of those eyes. Those sharp, alert eyes she had seen in the dark alley 2 weeks earlier, when he sat against the wall with a wound in his shoulder, telling her, "You don't need to know why," in the voice of someone used to giving orders. Rowan Kessler. The man she had saved in the alley was Rowan Kessler. Marin stood still for a moment, her hand tightening around the strap of her medical kit. Now she understood. She understood why he had refused the hospital. She understood why a black vehicle had come for him within minutes. She understood why the envelope of money had been so thick, sent as casually as one might send a card. She was looking at him on the stage when Rowan glanced down into the crowd, and his gaze stopped. He saw her. Marin saw him tilt his head slightly, as though confirming what he had just noticed. Then he stepped down from the stage, said a few words to the person beside him, and walked straight toward the area where she stood. Beckett followed behind, and later he would say it was the first time in 8 years of working for Rowan that he had seen his employer move toward someone not because of business. "Miss Shaw." Rowan stopped in front of her, his voice low, meant only for the 2 of them. "How is your shoulder?" Marin asked, almost by reflex. Rowan seemed slightly surprised that the first thing she said was not "Who are you?" or "Why are you here?" but a question about his injury. "It is healing," he replied. "I monitored it for exactly 2 weeks, as you instructed." "Good," Marin nodded. Then she looked at him, her gaze steady, neither avoiding nor welcoming. "Now I know who you are, and I am not sure that is a good thing." Rowan studied her for a long moment. Around them, hundreds of people were laughing, talking, raising glasses. But he stood in the middle of that crowd, as though there were only the 2 of them in the room. "You knew me before you knew my name," he said. "You saw me in a state I never allow anyone to see. That is rare, and I don't forget rare things." Marin didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, then at Beckett, standing a few steps away, then back at him. "My sister Josie," she said slowly. "You know about her. Beckett told me you had someone look into me." Rowan didn't deny it. "Yes. Why?" "Because I wanted to know who the person was who saved me." "Now you know," Marin said. "I am a night shift nurse. My salary isn't enough to live on, and my sister is waiting for heart surgery. There is nothing special about that." "You refused my money," Rowan said. "In my world, that is very special." They looked at each other for a few seconds longer. Then Marin was the one who turned away first. "I need to return to my station," she said. "I hope the event is successful." She walked away, her back straight, without looking back. Rowan stood watching her, until Beckett spoke quietly. "You need to return to the main table." Rowan nodded and turned. But for the rest of the evening, Beckett noticed that his employer looked toward the backstage area more often than he looked at the stage. The event ended close to 11 o'clock that night. Marin packed up her medical kit, said goodbye to the two colleagues on duty with her, then stepped out through the back exit of the hotel. She had just taken out her phone to call for a ride, when she noticed the black sport utility vehicle already parked along the curb, Beckett, standing beside the door, giving her a slight nod. "Mr. Kessler would like to take you home." Marin looked at the vehicle, then at Beckett. She was about to refuse, but the rear door was already open, and Rowan sat inside, looking out. He said nothing, didn't invite, didn't insist. He simply looked at her, then shifted slightly to one side, leaving the seat beside him empty. Marin stood still for a few seconds before stepping into the vehicle. She sat close to the opposite door, keeping a clear distance. The car pulled away, Beckett driving, and no one spoke during the first few minutes. Rowan looked out the window. Marin looked toward the other side. Chicago at night moved past them outside, streetlights stretching into long streaks of light. "Which area do you live in?" Rowan asked, without turning his head. "Bridgeport, the south side." Rowan gave a slight nod and told Beckett the address. The car turned south. Silence lingered for a while longer. Then Marin spoke, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I haven't had dinner yet. I have been on duty since 6 o'clock and only had a cup of coffee." Rowan turned to look at her. Then he faced forward again and spoke briefly. "Beckett, stop somewhere with food." Beckett didn't question it, only glanced once in the rearview mirror before turning onto a smaller street. The car stopped in front of a roadside diner, the kind that stayed open late. Fluorescent lights casting a stark white glow, plastic tables and chairs, a printed menu taped to the wall. Marin walked in naturally, as if she came here every week. Rowan followed behind her, and from the driver's seat outside, Beckett watched the sight of Rowan Kessler, a man whose meetings with financial elites were always held in restaurants, with waiting lists stretching for months, now standing in the middle of a modest diner in a tailored suit, looking at a paper menu on the wall with the eyes of someone who didn't know what to choose. Marin pulled out a chair and sat down, glancing at him still standing. "Sit down. I will order for you." Rowan took the seat across from her. Marin ordered 2 bowls of chicken noodle soup and 2 glasses of iced tea, without asking what he wanted. When the food arrived, Rowan looked at the bowl in front of him, then at Marin. "You didn't ask what I wanted. You stood there staring at the menu for 30 seconds and could not decide. I saved time for both of us." Rowan looked at her for a moment longer, then picked up his spoon. He ate slowly, not because he was particular, but because he was trying to remember the last time he had sat somewhere like this. Marin finished before him, lifted her glass of iced tea, and watched him. "The last time I sat somewhere like this," Rowan said, his eyes still on the bowl, "was when my father was still alive. He used to take me out for late-night meals at a small place near the harbor. He said it was the only place where he was not Kessler, just a father eating with his son." Marin didn't ask when his father had died, didn't ask how. She simply stood, walked to the counter, and ordered another glass of iced tea for him. She placed it in front of Rowan, then sat back down without a word. Rowan looked at the glass, then at her. He didn't say thank you, but he drank it all. They sat there a while longer. Marin asked, her voice even. "Do you often eat alone?" Rowan set the glass down. "I eat with many people. Lunch with partners, dinner with the family council, receptions with people who want something from me." He paused. "But sitting alone like this, in a place like this, with someone who wants nothing from me, it has been a long time." Marin looked at him without speaking, but her eyes softened just a little. It was not pity. Marin Shaw was not the kind of person who pitied anyone, but she understood what it meant to feel alone in a crowd, because she lived that way every day at the hospital, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet with no one who truly asked if she was tired, except Josie. Rowan paid for the meal with cash worth many times the bill, and didn't wait for change. They stepped back outside. Beckett drove them toward Bridgeport, stopping in front of the old apartment building where Marin lived. Marin opened the door, stepped out, then turned back to look at Rowan. "Thank you for the meal," she said. "And next time, if you want to eat somewhere like that, you don't need a black sport utility vehicle. The bus would suit it better." The corner of Rowan's mouth lifted slightly, not enough to be called a smile, but enough for Beckett to catch in the rearview mirror and remember. Marin turned and walked into the building. Rowan remained seated in the car, watching until the light in her third-floor apartment came on. Only then did he speak. "Go." Beckett pulled the car away without asking any questions, but he had driven for Rowan Kessler for 8 years, had taken him to the most important and most dangerous meetings, and he had never seen his employer sit and wait until someone turned on a light before choosing to leave. That night, for the first time in a very long time, Rowan Kessler looked like an ordinary man. Constance Kessler was not a woman easily deceived. She had lived within this family for 15 years, from the day Rowan's father was still alive and chose her as his second wife, to the day he passed and Rowan took control. Those 15 years had taught her one thing above all others, that in this world, information was power. She had her own people placed everywhere. Not many, not loud, but enough for her to know everything she needed to know. And when one of them reported that Rowan Kessler, a man who never looked at anyone for more than 3 seconds, had been spending time with a night shift nurse from St. Michael Hospital, Constance knew something was wrong. She had the girl investigated. The report came back. Marin Shaw, 27 years old, a nurse, living alone in Bridgeport, with a younger sister hospitalized for a heart condition. No background, no connections, no money. Constance finished reading the report, set it down on the table, and felt anger rise within her. Not because Rowan was showing interest in a woman, she had expected that to happen eventually, but because of who that woman was. A girl with no name, no family, nothing but a nurse's uniform, and a growing stack of hospital bills. In Constance's mind, there was only one reasonable explanation. The girl must have used some kind of scheme. Rowan Kessler was not the kind of man to fall for someone without cause. This girl must have done something to pull him toward her. Constance didn't know that Marin had once saved Rowan in a dark alley. She didn't know about the envelope of money that had been returned, about the late-night meal in a modest diner, about the way Rowan had watched the light come on in Marin's third-floor apartment. She saw only a poor girl stepping into her territory, and she decided to stop it before it was too late. At the monthly family dinner held at the Kessler estate, Constance arranged everything. She invited an additional guest, Felicity Grant, 29 years old, daughter of Harold Grant, head of a financial family that had long-standing business ties with the Kesslers. Felicity arrived in an elegant black dress, her smile perfectly measured, her greetings delivered in proper order to each person present. She knew how to function in this world because she had been born into it. Constance seated Felicity right beside Rowan at the main table. When Rowan entered the dining room, he saw Felicity, saw the seating arrangement, and saw Constance standing at the head of the table with the satisfied smile of someone waiting to watch a performance she herself had directed. Rowan understood immediately. He took his seat, didn't look at Felicity, didn't greet her. Felicity turned toward him, beginning the conversation with a confident and friendly tone. "Mr. Kessler, it is a pleasure to meet you. My father often speaks of the Kessler family with admiration." Rowan gave a slight nod and replied briefly, "Please extend my thanks to your father." Then he turned to speak with the person seated on his other side. Throughout the dinner, Felicity made 3 attempts to reopen the conversation. Rowan answered each time in no more than a single sentence. Constance sat observing, the smile on her face thinning with each instance Felicity was dismissed. When the dinner ended, Constance rose and spoke in front of the entire table. "Rowan, Felicity is an excellent young woman. The Grant family and the Kessler family have always shared a close relationship. I believe the two of you should spend more time getting to know one another." The table fell silent. Felicity looked at Rowan with expectation. Rowan placed his napkin on the table and stood. He looked at Constance, his voice not loud, yet each word fell with the weight of stone. "You don't have the right to choose a wife for me." Then he walked out of the dining room. No explanation, no apology, no backward glance. The entire table remained still. Felicity kept her composure, but beneath the table, her hand tightened around the napkin she held. Constance stood at the head of the table, her face pale, though she didn't allow it to show before her guests. She waited until the guests had all left, until Felicity had been escorted to her car, until the estate had fallen quiet. Then she went straight to Rowan's study. He sat behind his desk, reading through a set of documents as though what had just occurred in the dining room didn't exist. Constance closed the door and stood before his desk. "I do everything for your benefit," she said, her voice controlled but trembling slightly. "Felicity Grant is a perfect choice. Background, beauty, connections. She deserves to stand beside you, not an unknown nurse." Rowan didn't look up immediately. He finished the last line on the page before lifting his gaze to her. "You entered this family because my father chose you," he said, his voice calm but weighted in every word. "My father is gone. You remain because I allow it, Not because you hold any authority here." Constance drew in a sharp breath. She wanted to speak, but Rowan was not finished. "I don't hate you. In 15 years under this roof, I have never treated you poorly. But don't confuse my respect for you with a need for you. Those are two very different things." Constance stood still. For 15 years within the Kessler family, she had built her position as the lady of the house, convinced that she had influence, a voice, a place, and in the span of 30 seconds, Rowan had shown her how fragile all of that truly was. She turned and walked out, closing the door quietly, without slamming it, without making a sound. But as she moved down the hallway toward her private quarters, her steps were faster than usual, and her hands clenched tightly at the sides of her dress. Constance Kessler was not a woman who accepted defeat. She simply needed to change the way the game was played. After the night Rowan spoke to her so directly in his study, Constance could not sleep. She sat in her private room until nearly dawn, turning over every word he had said. "You remain because I allow it." That sentence burned in her, not as sorrow, but as anger, because it was true. Constance knew she could not confront Rowan directly. He controlled the money, the people, the authority to decide who stayed and who left this family. If she opposed him openly, she would lose everything. But she didn't need to oppose him. She only needed to remove the girl. The next morning, she called Felicity Grant. Felicity answered after the second ring, her voice still polite and measured as it had been at the dinner. Yet beneath that composure, Constance could hear the quiet strain of someone who had been slighted in front of an entire table. Constance didn't waste time. "Do you know why Rowan refused you last night?" "I have heard he is interested in someone," Felicity replied, her tone steady but tight. "A nurse," Constance said. "No background, no connections, nothing. She is attaching herself to my son, and I need your help to end this." Silence lingered for a few seconds. Then Felicity asked, "What do you need from me?" Constance needed precisely what she herself didn't possess: influence within the medical world. She was the lady of the Kessler family, powerful in finance and real estate, but public hospitals were not her domain. Felicity was different. The Grant family held shares in 3 of the largest medical insurance companies in the Great Lakes region and maintained close ties with the boards of many hospitals in Chicago. Felicity only needed to place the right call to the right person to make any employee's life difficult without leaving a trace. And she had reason to help. Rowan had dismissed her in front of the entire family. She was not someone who accepted being overlooked, especially not because of an unknown nurse. The two reached an understanding. Constance provided the information on Marin. Felicity acted. In the first week, Marin was reassigned shifts 3 times without warning, from her familiar night duty to morning, then to afternoon. Her schedule disrupted so completely that she could not even arrange time to visit Josie. In the second week, she was placed in charge of the most demanding ward in the hospital, her workload doubling, while other nurses at her level were given lighter assignments. Marin didn't complain. She endured it, returned home exhausted, slept for a few hours, then went back to work. In the third week, the floor supervisor called her in, pointed out 3 minor errors in patient records that ordinarily would have gone unnoticed. But now they were documented as formal warnings. Marin looked at the report and knew something was wrong, but she had no evidence and no one to ask. Constance summoned Marin to the Kessler estate. In a room 10 times the size of her apartment, she signaled to a man who placed a suitcase on the table and opened it. Inside was more money than Marin had ever seen in her life. "Take it," Constance said, her eyes cold, looking at Marin like a stain on the marble floor. "Take the money and get out of my son's life." Marin looked at the suitcase. She thought of Josie, of the mounting hospital bills, of the nights she sat counting every dollar of her salary. The amount in that suitcase was enough to clear the debt and secure Josie's surgery immediately. But Marin Shaw pushed the suitcase back. "I don't sell myself," she said. "And if your employer's son doesn't want me here, he can say it himself. He doesn't need anyone to speak for him." The man took the suitcase and left. 15 minutes later, Constance received a message. She refused. Constance set her phone down and called Felicity. "End this." Felicity understood. The next day, Marin was called into the Human Resources office. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. They presented the 3 warnings issued over 3 weeks, stated that her performance didn't meet requirements, and informed her that her contract was terminated. Marin sat and listened without arguing. She knew it would change nothing. Those warnings had been constructed to provide legal grounds, and the people behind them held enough power to ensure any complaint would disappear before reaching anyone who mattered. She signed the papers, stood, and went to her employee locker. She opened it and took out her coat, her personal antiseptic kit, and the small photograph of Josie she had taped inside the locker door. She placed everything into her bag, closed the locker, and returned the key. Then she walked out of St. Michael Hospital, where she had worked for 7 years, where she knew every corridor, every monitor's soft beep, every patient's face at 3 o'clock in the morning. She walked out and didn't look back. On the first day after losing her job, Marin sat down at the small kitchen table in her Bridgeport apartment, opened her laptop, and began sending out job applications. She applied to Northwestern Hospital, Rush Hospital, Mercy Hospital, the University of Illinois Medical Center, and 4 other private clinics across the Chicago area. 7 years of experience as a nurse. No history of violations before the final 3 weeks at St. Michael. A clean record. She believed that at least one place would call her back. In the first week, no one did. In the second week, she received 4 rejection emails, all written the same way. We appreciate your application, but the position has already been filled. In the third week, she called the Human Resources office at Rush Hospital directly, where she knew for certain they were short on night shift nurses, because a former colleague had just sent her a message. The recruiter heard her name, went silent for a few seconds, then said the position was no longer open. Marin hung up, watched the screen of her phone fade to black, and for the first time understood that this was not bad luck. Someone was blocking her. She didn't know exactly what Felicity Grant had done, didn't know which calls had been made, what had been said, or to whom. She only knew that every hospital door in Chicago had closed to her at once, and that was not coincidence. But Marin didn't have time to be angry. Josie's hospital bill for the month was coming due. Her savings would cover only 2 more weeks of living, and Josie's surgery could not be postponed any longer. She needed money, needed it immediately, and if no one would hire her as a nurse, she would do whatever someone was willing to pay her to do. She found work at a diner on Halsted Street, the kind that opened from the afternoon until 2 in the morning, serving quick meals to night shift workers and late drinking customers. The owner hired her without many questions, paid her hourly plus tips, and had her start the very next evening. Marin tied on an apron, carried trays of food, wiped tables, poured water, cleared dirty dishes. The hands that once held syringes and checked blood pressure now carried heavy trays back and forth between the kitchen and the dining area. She didn't complain. She arrived on time, did the work, and left when her shift ended. One night, around midnight, a drunk customer at a corner table called her over. He wanted to change his order, even though the food had already been served. Marin explained that she would speak to the kitchen, but he didn't want to listen. He waved his hand, knocked the plate to the floor, sauce splattering onto Marin's shoes, then shouted at her in the slurred voice of someone who had drunk too much. The diner fell silent for a few seconds. Marin looked at the plate on the floor, at the stain on her shoes, then bent down to pick it up. She wiped the floor with the cloth draped over her shoulder, said nothing, didn't look at him, didn't react. The owner came to handle the customer, and Marin carried the tray of dirty dishes into the kitchen, set it down by the sink, then stood there alone for a few seconds. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from lack of sleep or physical labor, but from swallowing everything and never being allowed to let it spill out. The shift ended close to 2 in the morning. Marin collected her tips from the owner, slipped them into her coat pocket, and walked home through the cold wind. The apartment was dark and quiet when she opened the door. She didn't turn on the living room light, went straight into the kitchen, sat down on the worn chair beside the table, and took out the tips to count. She laid each bill on the table, sorted them by type, counting slowly. The total she earned that night was an amount that 7 years ago, when she first became a nurse, she would have considered a week of breakfast money. Now it was her entire night's income. She took a small notebook from the drawer and opened to the page listing this month's hospital bill. The debt was written on one line, the money she had on the line below. The distance between those 2 lines felt wider than any alley she had ever walked through. A full night of tips was not even half of what she needed to pay for the month. Marin closed the notebook. She lifted her head and looked at the photograph of Josie taped to the refrigerator door. In the picture, Josie was smiling, her hair loose, looking far healthier than she did lying in a hospital bed. Marin looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she stood, washed her face, set her alarm for 6 a.m. for the next day's shift at the diner. She lay down on the bed, pulled the blanket over herself, and closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She didn't call Rowan. She had Beckett's number, the one he had left the day he came to the hospital, but she never used it. Marin Shaw's pride was not something that could be broken by a suitcase of money or a termination letter. But that night, lying in the darkness of her Bridgeport apartment, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket, she felt that pride heavier than it had ever been. Beckett was not a man who spoke unless it was necessary, but that morning, when he stepped into Rowan's office and placed a file on the desk, his expression spoke before his mouth did. Rowan looked up, saw that expression, and knew immediately this was not business. Marin Shaw was dismissed from St. Michael 3 weeks ago, Beckett said. The official reason was unsatisfactory performance. 3 formal warnings issued over 3 consecutive weeks. Rowan said nothing, but the pen in his hand stopped mid-motion. After the dismissal, she applied to 7 hospitals and clinics across Chicago. All of them rejected her. All. Beckett opened the file. I traced it back. The 3 warnings at St. Michael were all issued by the floor supervisor. But that supervisor was only appointed 2 months ago by the hospital board. One of the board members is tied to Grove Atlantic Insurance, which is owned by the Grant family. Rowan set the pen down. Felicity Grant. Yes. Felicity didn't call each hospital directly. She worked through the insurance network. Grove Atlantic provides coverage for 4 of the 7 hospitals Marin applied to. She only needed 1 call to the right person on the board, and Marin's file was flagged before Human Resources even opened it. Rowan remained still. Beckett recognized that silence. It was not the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone restraining himself. And Constance? Rowan asked, his voice lower than usual. Felicity Grant has no personal reason to target a night shift nurse she has never met, Beckett said. The only reason she would act is because someone asked her to, and the only person with motive to ask is Constance. Rowan gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as though confirming something he had already known before Beckett spoke it aloud. Anything else? Marin is currently working as a server at a late-night diner on Halsted Street. Her shift runs from 6 in the evening to 2 in the morning. Hourly pay plus tips. Beckett paused. She hasn't contacted you. No calls, no messages. She has my number, but hasn't used it once. Rowan rose from his chair. He walked to the window, looked out over the city, and stood there for a long moment. Beckett knew better than to speak, but he also knew his employer needed one more piece placed into the picture. What do you want me to do? Call Constance here. Now. 45 minutes later, Constance entered Rowan's office. She wore a pale gray suit, her hair neatly pinned, her posture as straight as ever. She saw Rowan standing behind the desk, not seated, and Beckett in the corner of the room. She knew this was not an ordinary conversation. Sit down, Rowan said. Constance took the chair across from the desk. Rowan didn't sit. He remained standing, looking down at her, and Constance realized this was the first time he had taken this posture with her. Not the posture of a son speaking to a stepmother. This was the posture of the head of a family passing judgment. You sent someone with money to Marin Shaw to force her to leave, Rowan said. Not a question. A statement. She refused. Then you called Felicity Grant and had her use connections within the insurance system to pressure St. Michael to produce 3 fabricated warnings and dismiss Marin. After that, Felicity blocked her from every other hospital in the city. Now she is carrying food in a diner on Halsted Street because you decided she was unworthy. Constance opened her mouth. Rowan, I haven't given you permission to speak. The words cut through the room like a blade. Constance closed her mouth. Beckett stood in silence in the corner, but he had never heard Rowan speak to Constance in that tone. For 15 years, Rowan had always been courteous to her, distant but proper. Now that courtesy was gone. I told you once, Rowan continued, his voice not raised, yet weighted in every word. You remain in this family because I allow it. I allow it because I respect you. But if you touch her one more time, whether directly or through Felicity Grant, or through anyone else, I will cut off every account you have. Every credit line, every allowance, every privilege you receive from the Kessler family will be frozen within 24 hours. Constance looked at him, and for the first time she saw something in Rowan's eyes she had never seen before. Not the familiar coldness, not indifference. Anger. Real anger. The kind Rowan Kessler reserved for enemies who threatened his family. And now he was using it for a nurse. And Felicity Grant, Rowan added. You will tell her that if I see her name tied to anything involving Marin Shaw again, the Grant family will lose every contract they have with Kessler Corporation. Every contract. You will repeat it exactly. Rowan turned his back and looked out the window, a signal that the conversation was over. Constance stood. She walked to the door, her back still straight, her head still held high, but her steps quicker than usual. When the door closed behind her, Beckett looked at Rowan. Will she stop? Rowan remained facing the window. She will stop out of fear, not yet out of understanding. He turned back to the desk, sat down, remained silent for a moment, then said, Find the address of that diner on Halsted Street. Constance returned to her private room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her bed. She didn't cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried, but she sat there for a long time, staring into the empty space before her. She had spent 15 years in this family, building her place piece by piece, and now she understood that everything she had rested on a thread, Rowan could cut at any moment. She was afraid, but she didn't yet understand. And because she didn't understand, she only stopped. She had not yet changed. That evening, Rowan arrived at the diner on Halsted Street at 9 o'clock. He didn't bring Beckett. For the first time in a long while, he drove himself, a dark sedan instead of the usual black sport utility vehicle. He parked a short distance away, walked in, chose a table in the far corner, and sat down. The diner was moderately busy, soft music drifting from an old speaker behind the counter, a fluorescent light flickering faintly in one corner of the ceiling. Rowan ordered a black coffee and sat in silence. He saw Marin the moment she stepped out from the kitchen, a tray balanced in her hands, an apron tied at her waist, her hair pulled up high. She moved between tables quickly and efficiently, setting plates down, clearing dishes, refilling water, without a single complaint, without a moment to pause. Rowan sat there for nearly 3 hours, finishing 2 cups of coffee, watching her work. He watched the hands that had once treated his wound in a dark alley now carrying heavy trays back and forth. He watched her kneel to wipe the floor when a customer accidentally spilled a drink, then rise again, straighten her back, and move on to the next table. And he understood, more clearly than any report Beckett had ever placed before him, that what Constance and Felicity had done had brought her here. Close to midnight, the diner began to empty. Marin cleared the last table, untied her apron, said a few words to the owner, then stepped out through the back door. She slipped on her coat, took out her phone to check the time, then looked up and saw Rowan leaning against the dark sedan parked a few steps from the rear entrance. Marin stopped. She looked at him, then at the car, then back at him. How do you know I am here? She asked, her voice neither angry nor warm. Rowan looked at her. He didn't answer that question, not because he could not, but because the truth of it didn't matter as much as what he needed to say. I know what happened, he said. I know what Constance did. I know what Felicity Grant did. I know you were dismissed, and that no hospital in Chicago will hire you. Marin stood still, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. She was not surprised that he knew. She was surprised that he came. I didn't come to give you money, Rowan continued. He knew that would be the first thing she would assume, and he wanted to take it away before she could say it. I didn't bring an envelope. I didn't bring a suitcase. I didn't bring anything. I came because I want to be here. Marin looked at him. The streetlight cast across his face, and she saw that Rowan Kessler, in this moment, didn't resemble the man who stood on the stage at the charity event, nor the one who sat behind a desk issuing orders to an entire family. He looked like the man in the dark alley that night, only this time the wound was not in his shoulder. It was somewhere else. Mr. Kessler, Marin said slowly, I lost my job because someone in your family decided I was not worthy. I can't find work anywhere because your family's reach is longer than I thought. I am carrying trays in a late-night diner to gather money for my sister's hospital bills, and you stand here saying you want to be here. She paused. Do you know what that means to me? Rowan looked at her, but didn't answer. He waited. Marin's eyes reddened. She didn't turn away, didn't cover her face, didn't try to hide it. She stood there on the curb outside the back door of a diner on Halsted Street and cried. Not loudly, just tears slipping down her face in silence, as though they had been waiting a long time to fall. Marin Shaw didn't cry because she was weak. She cried because for 7 years as a nurse she had cared for thousands of people, and no one had asked what she needed. When she lost her job, she didn't cry. When she counted tips at 2 a.m, she didn't cry. When food was thrown at her feet, she didn't cry. But when someone came and said, "I want to be here without condition," not because of who she was or what she had, simply because he wanted to be there, she could not hold it back anymore. Rowan said nothing. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch her, didn't try to comfort her with words. He simply stood there in silence and let her cry, because he understood that sometimes what a person needed was not words or action, but someone who would stand there and not leave. Maren wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and drew in a long breath. Then she looked toward the bench along the curb in front of the diner, walked over, and sat down. Rowan followed and sat beside her, leaving just enough space between them. They sat there in silence. Halsted Street at midnight was quiet and cold. A few cars passing, headlights sweeping across the pavement before fading away. No one spoke for a long time. Then Rowan spoke, his voice low. "Do you want to stay?" Maren understood that he was not asking whether she wanted to stay at the diner, or in Chicago, or anywhere specific. He was asking whether she wanted to remain in his life, even though that life was filled with the very things that had already hurt her. Maren was silent. She looked down at her shoes, still marked faintly with sauce from nights before, then at Rowan's polished black leather shoes beside hers. Two worlds so different it almost felt absurd. And yet he was sitting here, on a curbside bench, outside a late-night diner, at midnight, without a bodyguard, without money, carrying nothing but a question. Maren nodded, slow, small, but clear. She said nothing more. Neither did he. They sat beside each other a while longer in silence before Rowan stood, drove her home, and waited until the light in her third-floor apartment came on before he finally drove away. Constance stepped back, but Felicity didn't. After receiving the warning relayed through Constance, Felicity understood that the older woman had retreated. But Felicity Grant was not Constance Kessler. She didn't live in the Kessler estate, didn't depend on Rowan's accounts, and didn't fear having her allowance cut off. The Grant family had its own empire, and Felicity had her own pride. That pride had been crushed in front of an entire dinner table when Rowan said, "You don't have the right to choose my wife," and walked away without looking at her even once. Felicity no longer needed Constance. She acted on her own. In Chicago's upper circles, rumors traveled faster than any news broadcast. Felicity knew this because she had grown up in that world, knew exactly who to speak to, so that a story could move from one dinner table to another boardroom within 48 hours. She began with coffee meetings, lunches, and carefully casual phone calls with the wives of business partners connected to the Kessler family. The content was always the same, only the phrasing adjusted for each listener. Rowan Kessler was involved with an unknown nurse. The girl had a sister in the hospital and was using Rowan to pay medical bills. And there was one more detail. Felicity invented herself. The nurse was not as innocent as she appeared. She was involved with another man in Bridgeport, using Rowan as a ticket out of poverty. The rumor spread for 2 weeks, from dining tables to boardrooms, from boardrooms to the Council of Elders of the Kessler family. The council consisted of 5 men, all cousins or longtime partners of Rowan's father. People who still had a voice in the family even though real power now rested in Rowan's hands. They requested a meeting. Rowan agreed. The meeting took place in the main conference room of the Kessler estate. The 5 elders sat around the long table, Rowan at the head, Beckett standing behind him. The first to speak was Gerald Kessler, Rowan's father's cousin and the oldest among them. "Rowan, we don't interfere in your personal life, but when personal matters affect the reputation of the family, we have a responsibility to speak. You are involved with a girl the financial world is talking about. They say she is using you. They say she isn't respectable. We don't know what is true, but the fact that people are talking is already a problem." 2 other elders nodded in agreement. One added that 3 major partners had privately asked him about Rowan's nurse in the past week. Another said the family could not allow an unclear relationship to destabilize business agreements currently under negotiation. Rowan listened from beginning to end without interrupting. When the last man finished, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Rowan stood slowly. He looked at each face around the table, from Gerald to the youngest member of the council. "You sit at this table because my father built this family and invited you in," Rowan said, his voice not loud, but every word clear. "My father is gone, and I am the one who keeps this family standing. I hold the contracts. I hold the territory. I hold every dollar you are benefiting from. And now you sit here telling me who I should keep or remove from my life because people are talking." He paused, letting the words settle. "Anyone who wants to leave the family over this, I will sign the papers right now, in front of everyone." No one spoke. Gerald lowered his gaze to the table. The two who had nodded earlier now looked away. The room was silent. Rowan waited 10 seconds more, then walked out. Beckett followed and closed the door behind him. Rowan won in that room. But outside it, rumors didn't stop because he commanded them to. They had already spread far enough to reach Marin. She heard it from the owner of the diner where she worked. He didn't say it directly, only turned on the television to a local entertainment news program, where a short segment mentioned the heir of the Kessler family and a controversial relationship. It didn't name Marin, but the description was detailed enough for her to understand they were talking about her. A nurse who had been dismissed, with a sister in the hospital, rumored to be using the most powerful man in Chicago. Marin turned off her phone after reading a few more posts on social media. She didn't call Rowan to ask. She didn't text Beckett. She didn't demand explanations, didn't confront, didn't rage. She simply withdrew. Rowan called her. She didn't answer. He sent messages. She read them but didn't reply. He sent Beckett to the diner on Halsted Street. The owner said she still showed up on time, but had asked to switch shifts to avoid the hours Rowan usually came. Beckett reported back. "She is avoiding you." Rowan sat in silence for a long time. He understood that Marin was not avoiding him because she believed the rumors. She was not the kind of person who would trust strangers over what she had seen with her own eyes in a dark alley, over what she had felt sitting beside him on a curb at midnight. She avoided him because she believed her presence was causing him trouble. She believed she was a burden, and that was what Marin Shaw feared most. More than losing her job, more than counting tips at 2 a.m, she feared becoming someone else's burden, just as she feared Josie seeing herself that way. Rowan looked out the window. He knew that if he let Marin walk away on her own, she would disappear from his life without a word. She would cut it cleanly, decisively, the same way she had walked out of St. Michael without looking back. And he would not allow that to happen. Rowan was not a man who waited. In his world, waiting meant yielding ground to an opponent. But with Marin, he had waited 3 days. 3 days in which she didn't answer his calls, didn't reply to his messages, didn't allow him anywhere near. 3 days in which he sat in his office, knowing exactly where she was and what she was doing, yet unable to reach her. On the 4th day, he decided he would not wait any longer. Rowan went to the diner on Halsted Street just as her shift was ending. This time, he didn't sit in a corner and watch. He stood right in front of the entrance, beneath the streetlight, so she would see him the moment she stepped out. Marin pushed open the back door, saw him, and stopped. She was not surprised. She had known he would come sooner or later. She just had not known what she would say when she saw him. "Mr. Kessler, 3 days you haven't answered my calls," Rowan said without preface. "I am not asking why. I only want to ask one thing, and I want the truth." Marin looked at him and waited. "Are you avoiding me because you believe what people are saying, or because you are afraid your presence is making things harder for me?" Marin was silent. She looked down at her shoes, then up at the sky, then back at him. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but softer than usual. "I don't believe those rumors. I know who I am, and I know who you are. But I also know that since I stepped into your life, your family has held meetings because of me. Your stepmother has started a war because of me. Your partners are talking because of me. I don't belong in your world, and I am afraid that every day I stay is another day I cause trouble for you." Rowan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes there was something Beckett had never seen in all the years he had worked for him. Not softer, but deeper. Then Rowan spoke. "Get in the car. Where are you taking me? Come with me." Marin studied him for a few seconds more, then stepped into the car. Rowan drove himself. Beckett was not there. The car moved through downtown Chicago, turned into the financial district, and stopped in front of a high rise of glass and steel. Rowan led her into a private elevator and pressed the top floor. When the doors opened, Marin stepped into his penthouse. She didn't look around, didn't take in the interior. Rowan didn't offer her a seat, didn't pour her a drink, didn't explain anything. He walked straight to the glass doors at the far end of the living room and opened them. Beyond was the terrace. Marin followed him outside. The night wind in Chicago was cold, brushing lightly through her hair, and in front of her, below, the entire city stretched out. millions of lights running along streets, bridges, the river. Lake Michigan reflecting the glow along the horizon. Maren stood by the railing and looked down. She had never seen Chicago from this angle. From her third-floor apartment in Bridgeport, all she ever saw were the rooftops across from her and her neighbors' laundry lines. From here, the city felt like something else entirely. They stood side by side in silence for a while. Then Maren asked softly, "You stand here and look down every night. What do you see?" Rowan looked out over the city. He took a few seconds before answering, as if he were truly considering the question instead of offering a practiced reply. "Before, I saw territory," he said. "Each neighborhood was something I controlled or was fighting for. Every light was a deal, an investment, a relationship to maintain or to cut. I stood here and looked down like I was looking at a battlefield map." He paused. "Now I see a city that has you in it. There is a third-floor apartment in Bridgeport where I wait every night for the light to turn on before I leave. There is a hospital where Josie is lying. There is a diner on Halstead Street where you carry trays you should never have had to carry, and I see all of that as more important than any territory I hold." Maren looked at him. The wind moved quietly through the space between them. She didn't speak right away, letting his words settle, making sure she had heard them correctly. Then she said, her voice calm but warmer than it had been outside the diner, "You don't need to speak beautifully. You only need to speak truth." Rowan turned to her, and he smiled. Not a wide smile, not laughter, just the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, his eyes softening for a moment, his usually cold and rigid face briefly resembling that of an ordinary man. If Beckett had been there, he would have remembered that moment for the rest of his life, because in 8 years, he had never seen his boss smile for anyone. "I am telling the truth," Rowan said. "I have never been good at lying. You can ask Beckett." Maren looked out over the city once more. Millions of lights below, and she stood above all of it beside a man half of Chicago feared, and the other half wanted to bring down. She didn't belong here. She knew that. But standing there, with the night wind brushing past and hearing him say things she knew he didn't say to anyone else, she felt that perhaps belonging was not about a place. It was about the person standing beside you. They remained on the terrace for a long time, saying nothing more. There was no need. Below them, Chicago continued to move, to glow, to hum. But up there, between the wind and the silence, two people from different worlds stood side by side, and the distance between them had never been smaller. It was the last quiet night before everything fell apart. 2 days after the night on the terrace, Maren went to Cook County Hospital to visit Josie as she did every week. Josie looked better than before, able to sit up, eating more, and the doctors said the surgery could be scheduled within a few weeks if her indicators remained stable. Maren sat beside her bed for half an hour, listening as she talked about the book she was reading, then kissed her forehead before leaving. She stepped out through the main entrance of the hospital at nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sunlight slanted softly, a light breeze moving through the air, a few cars passing slowly along the road in front of the entrance. Maren had just stepped down the last stair when she heard the screech of brakes. She turned her head. A black sedan was speeding along the stretch of road in front of the hospital, far too fast. The car swerved, veered to the right, then slammed into the divider and struck a streetlight pole. The impact rang out sharp and brief, glass shattering across the pavement, the vehicle coming to a tilted stop, its front end crushed. Maren ran toward it immediately, instinct moving before thought could catch up. She was the first to reach the car. The driver in the front seat was unconscious, head slumped to one side, the airbag deployed. She looked toward the back seat and froze. Constance Kessler. The woman sat in the rear, her head leaning against the window, eyes closed, a long wound across her forehead, her body completely still. Maren stood there, her hand still gripping the strap of her bag, her feet already having moved forward while the rest of her body locked in place. She looked at Constance's face, and in her mind everything came rushing back. Not individual events, not specific words, just fragments of images. The suitcase of money dropped at her feet in that large room. The dismissal notice at St. Michael Hospital, her shoes stained with sauce as she wiped the floor of the late-night diner. The small bills lined up on her kitchen table at 2 a.m. All of it traced back to the woman lying motionless before her. The woman who had looked at her as if she were a stain on polished marble. The woman who had said, "Leave my son's life," with the voice of someone brushing aside an insect. The woman who had destroyed 7 years of her career without hesitation. Maren stood there, maybe for seconds, maybe longer. She didn't know, because time in moments like that didn't move normally. It stretched, heavy, as if each second was asking her a question she had to answer herself. She could turn and walk away, call for help and leave it to someone else. No one would blame her. No one would know she had ever stood here, and Constance Kessler, who had not hesitated a single moment to ruin her life, would lie there waiting for a stranger to save her. Then Maren looked at the wound on Constance's forehead. The blood was spreading, her skin pale, her lips slightly parted, her breathing shallow and weak, and the instinct built from 7 years as a nurse, an instinct no suitcase of money could buy and no termination notice could erase, pulled Maren forward. She opened the rear car door carefully, avoiding unnecessary movement in case of spinal injury. She opened her bag, took out the small gauze packet she still carried out of habit, and began treating the wound on Constance's forehead, cleaning, pressing, holding firm. Constance let out a faint groan, her eyes fluttering open. "Don't move," Maren said, her voice calm and steady, the same voice she used with patients at 3 a.m. in the emergency room. "You were in a car accident. I am giving you first aid. An ambulance is on the way." Constance looked up, her gaze unfocused, struggling to concentrate. And when she finally saw the face of the woman pressing gauze to her forehead, she stilled. She recognized Maren. Maren looked back at her, and in that moment there was something in the eyes of both women that no words could fully hold. Not forgiveness, not hatred, only the stark truth that one had once destroyed the other, and the other was now saving her life, and both of them knew it. "Look at me," Maren said, her voice still even. "You must not close your eyes. You look at me and listen to me. Your name is Constance Kessler. You are outside Cook County Hospital, and you are going to be all right." Constance looked at her, her lips moving but no words coming out. Maren kept talking, continuously, without pause, keeping her conscious. She spoke of anything that came to mind: the weather that day, the street in front of the hospital, the sound of cars passing. She didn't speak because she wanted conversation. She spoke because she knew that if Constance closed her eyes now, she might not open them again. The sound of an ambulance siren rose in the distance, then grew closer. 2 paramedics rushed over, and Maren reported the condition in a professional tone: the forehead wound, possible head trauma, weak pulse, semi-conscious but responsive, spinal injury, not yet determined. They lifted Constance onto a stretcher and moved her into the ambulance. Just before the doors closed, Constance turned her head and looked at Maren one last time. Maren stood on the curb, her hands still marked with antiseptic, watching the ambulance drive away. She remained there until the siren faded, then sat down on the steps in front of the hospital entrance. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but because she had just saved the life of the woman who had ruined hers, and she didn't know how she felt about that. She didn't forgive Constance. She was not sure she ever could. But she had seen the wound on her forehead, and she could not turn away, not because she was kind, but because she was a nurse. And 7 years of holding gauze, holding needles, holding the hands of patients at 3 a.m. had become something woven into her that she could not remove, even if she wanted to. Constance woke on the 2nd day after the accident. She opened her eyes in a private room at Cook County Hospital, the ceiling white above her, the steady rhythm of the monitor sounding beside her, and Rowan sitting in the chair next to the bed. She looked at him, parted her lips as if to speak, but Rowan only gave a small nod and told her she needed to rest. She listened, closing her eyes again. By the 2nd day, she was fully awake. The doctor came in to examine her and said she had a mild head injury. The wound on her forehead had been stitched, and there was no serious internal damage. She was lucky, very lucky. Constance asked who had given her first aid at the scene. The doctor said a young woman, likely a nurse, had treated the wound and kept her conscious until the ambulance arrived. She had reported the condition with precision, which allowed the emergency team to act more quickly. Constance didn't ask anything more. She didn't need to ask for a name. She remembered the face of the person holding the gauze to her forehead, remembered those eyes looking down at her, remembered the voice telling her not to close her eyes. Maren Shaw, the girl she had thrown a suitcase of money at, the girl she had driven out of the hospital, the girl she had called unworthy. That person had saved her life. Constance lay still for the next 3 days. She didn't call anyone, didn't ask for anything beyond water and medication. Rowan came to see her each day, sat for a while, then left. Beckett stood outside the door. No one spoke Maren's name, but it was present in the room as clearly as the sound of the monitor. On the fourth day, Constance told Rowan to call Marin. Rowan looked at her longer than usual, then nodded and called Beckett. Marin arrived at the hospital near late afternoon. She stepped into the room and stopped at the door. Constance lay in bed, propped against pillows, gray hair falling over her shoulders, the stitches on her forehead neatly bandaged. She looked smaller than the last time Marin had seen her at the Kessler estate, smaller even than when she had been sitting in the car after the crash. Hospital beds have a way of making people look smaller. Marin knew that after 7 years in the profession. "Come in, Miss Shaw," Constance said, her voice weaker than usual but still carrying that familiar directness. Marin stepped inside, standing beside the bed without sitting. The two women looked at each other. The last time they had been this close, one had thrown money and the other had pushed it back. Now one lay in a hospital bed and the other stood beside her, and the roles had completely reversed. Constance was silent for a moment, as if arranging each word in her mind. She wasn't someone accustomed to apologizing. 15 years in the Kessler family had taught her to command, to arrange, to decide. She didn't apologize, but now she owed her life to the person she had once considered less than a stain on the floor. "I was wrong about you," Constance said. No introduction, no preamble. "I thought you were someone who took advantage. I thought you used tricks to attach yourself to my son. I did everything I could to push you away." She paused, drawing a slow breath. "I'm not good at apologizing. I've never been good at it. But I owe you this life. And I know you didn't save me because you've forgiven me. You saved me because you're the kind of person who can't walk away when someone needs help. That made me understand why Rowan saw something in you that I didn't." Marin stood still, listening to every word. She didn't say it's all right. She didn't say I forgive you, because neither would be true. She only gave a small nod, then said, "You need to rest. The wound on your forehead will take at least 2 more weeks to fully heal. Don't move your head too much." Constance looked at her, and for the first time in their relationship, she didn't see a stain on polished stone. She saw a nurse speaking to a patient in a calm, professional voice, without resentment. Marin turned and walked out. After she left, Constance stared up at the ceiling for a long time in silence. Then she spoke, without looking at Rowan standing in the corner of the room. "I don't understand. I did everything as badly as I could to her. I destroyed her career. I threw money in her face. I called her unworthy. And still, she knelt beside me in the street and kept me alive until the ambulance came." She turned to look at Rowan. "Why?" Rowan looked at her, his eyes not as cold as usual, not warm, not entirely, but holding something Constance had never seen in him before. "That's why I chose her," he said. Then he walked out of the room, leaving Constance alone with that answer. Constance Kessler didn't become a good person after that day. She remained cold, remained proud, still carried that straight back and sharp gaze when looking at others. She didn't embrace Marin, didn't invite her to dinner, didn't call her daughter-in-law, but she stopped. She didn't call Felicity anymore. She didn't try to make trouble anymore. She didn't speak of Marin with contempt anymore. For someone like Constance Kessler, stopping was the greatest change she was capable of making, at least for now. When Constance stepped back, Felicity Grant realized she was standing alone. Constance didn't call anymore, didn't send messages, didn't answer the phone. The woman who had been her ally, her support, the one who had opened the door for her into the Kessler family, now fell silent as if Felicity had never existed. Felicity sat in the Grant family penthouse in the Gold Coast, staring at her phone screen with no new messages from Constance, and understood that the woman had truly withdrawn. She didn't know exactly what had happened at the hospital between Constance and Marin, only that Constance had been in an accident, and the nurse had saved her. But Felicity didn't care about that detail. She cared about one thing and one thing only. Rowan Kessler had rejected her in front of the entire family, and the girl who made him do it was still there, still standing beside him, still not gone. That was unacceptable. Felicity Grant had grown up in Chicago's upper circles, taught that everything has a price, and every battle has a way to be won. She had lost Constance, but she still had something else: information. During those weeks as Constance's ally, she had learned a great deal about the Kessler family. She knew the structure of power, knew the major contracts under negotiation, knew which relationships were strained, and she knew who Rowan's greatest enemy was: Paxton Hale. Felicity approached Paxton through an unofficial channel. She asked an acquaintance in finance to arrange an introduction, and met him at a private restaurant on the west side of Chicago. Paxton Hale didn't look like a dangerous enemy sitting across from her. He was about 36, dressed in a gray suit, speaking calmly, smiling at the right moments. But Felicity knew this was the man who had once controlled the entire transportation network across the Great Lakes before Rowan forced him out. Paxton had lost territory, lost money, lost people, and he was sitting here because he wanted it all back. "I have information about the Kessler family," Felicity said plainly, "and I have a personal reason to want Rowan Kessler to struggle." Paxton looked at her, measuring. "What do you want?" "I want a girl named Maren Shaw to disappear from Chicago, and I want Rowan to understand that he isn't untouchable." Paxton leaned forward slightly. "Go on." Felicity told him everything. She spoke about Maren, about her relationship with Rowan, about how Constance had tried and failed to remove the nurse. Then she said the one thing Paxton needed to hear. Maren Shaw has a younger sister named Josie Shaw, 19 years old, currently at Cook County Hospital, waiting for heart surgery. The surgery is scheduled in 2 weeks. That's the most important person in Maren's life, and Maren is the most important person in Rowan's. If you want to pressure Rowan without confronting him directly, that's the easiest place to do it. Paxton sat quietly for a moment, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. Then he nodded. "I'll handle my part. You handle the information for me." They shook hands. Felicity provided Paxton with the hospital's security schedule, visiting hours, the location of Josie's room, and the gaps in the system she had identified through her connections in healthcare. Paxton used that information to plan. 1 week before Josie's scheduled surgery, Maren went to the hospital to visit her as usual. She walked into Josie's room and found the bed empty, the blankets neatly folded, no personal belongings, no book her sister had been reading left on the bedside table. Maren stood in the middle of the empty room, staring at the bed without her sister, and for a few seconds she couldn't breathe. She ran to the nurse's station and asked. No one knew. She called the attending physician. No answer. She ran to security, reviewed the cameras, and saw that 3 hours earlier, 2 men dressed as medical staff had wheeled Josie out of the room in a wheelchair, taken her through the back exit, and loaded her into an unmarked white van. Maren stared at the footage, saw her sister sitting in the wheelchair, her face confused, not understanding what was happening, and she collapsed into a chair. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number, sent to Rowan but also to her. "Josie Shaw is with us. She is safe, for now. If you want her to remain safe, Rowan Kessler will withdraw from the Great Lakes port contract and come meet us alone. Location will be sent later. No police, no Kessler men. Otherwise, we don't guarantee the girl's health, especially with her heart condition." Maren read the message 3 times. Her hands shook, not the light trembling from before, but violently enough that she had to set the phone down for fear of dropping it. Josie, 19 years old, a heart condition, waiting for surgery, and now in the hands of people willing to use her as leverage to force Rowan Kessler to his knees. Maren called Rowan. He answered on the first ring. "I already know," he said before she could speak. "Beckett is tracing the location. I need you to stay calm." "Josie," Maren said, and her voice broke on that single word. Just one word, her sister's name, but it carried everything. Fear, desperation, and a plea Maren Shaw had never spoken to anyone in her life. "I will bring Josie back," Rowan said, his voice not loud but solid as steel. "I promise." Maren arrived at Rowan's office within 20 minutes after the call, her eyes still red but no longer crying, and she spoke plainly. "I'm going with you." Rowan looked at her and shook his head. "No, Josie is my sister, and if you walk into that place, they'll have 2 hostages instead of 1. I won't let that happen." Maren wanted to argue. She opened her mouth, but when she looked into Rowan's eyes, she saw something she had never seen in him before. Not the cold detachment he carried into meetings with the council, not the calm control he used with Constance, but fear. Rowan Kessler was afraid, not of Paxton, but of the possibility that if she went in there, he wouldn't be able to protect her. And that fear convinced Maren more than anything he could have said. She sat down, hands clenched tightly on her thighs. "Bring Josie back to me." "I already promised," Rowan said, then turned to Beckett. Beckett had been working nonstop since the message came in. The Kessler network stretched across Chicago, from the shipping ports to the industrial zones, from traffic cameras to people embedded deep within government offices. Within 3 hours, Beckett traced the unmarked white truck through 4 intersections, followed its path to an old warehouse in the southern industrial district near Calumet. Paxton chose that location because it lay outside Kessler's traditional territory. But Paxton forgot that Rowan Kessler doesn't have a traditional territory. He has territory everywhere. "Confirm Josie is inside?" Rowan asked. "Confirmed. 3 guards. Josie in the back room, Paxton in the front. Josie's condition: not harmed. Sitting on a chair, guarded but not restrained." Rowan nodded. He stood over the desk, studying the rough sketch Beckett had drawn of the warehouse, and within 10 minutes he built the plan. Simple. Rowan never liked complicated plans. He gave Beckett clear instructions. Beckett would take 4 men through the back entrance, neutralize the 3 guards, and get Josie out. At the same time, Rowan would enter through the front and meet Paxton, keeping him occupied. No force at first. Beckett looked at Rowan. "You're going in alone. Paxton wants me alone. I'll give him exactly what he wants, and if he doesn't cooperate, he will, because I'll show him the cost of not cooperating." 45 minutes later, Rowan pulled up in front of the warehouse in Calumet. He stepped out alone, empty-handed. The front door opened. One of Paxton's men led him inside. Paxton Hale stood in the middle of the room, hands in his pockets, watching Rowan approach with the smile of a man who thought he was winning. "Rowan Kessler. Right on time." "I'm always on time," Rowan replied, his voice flat. "The shipping contract," Paxton said. "You sign it over to me, the girl goes home. Simple." Rowan looked at him, then glanced around the room, counting. 2 men behind Paxton. The back room door closed, just as Beckett reported. "I have another offer," Rowan said, stepping forward once. "Before you make any offers, you should remember that I'm holding what you want," Paxton replied confidently. "Yes, you're holding the sister of the person I care about most, and that's the biggest mistake you've ever made." Rowan spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "I've collected everything on your operations over the past 3 years. Illegal transport networks, money laundering through 5 shell companies, 2 black warehouses out west. It's all on a drive, ready to go to the FBI with 1 call." Paxton went still. His smile faded. "You're bluffing. Have I ever lied to anyone, Paxton? Ask anyone who's done business with me." Rowan stepped closer. "Here's my offer. You release her. You leave Chicago, and I let you walk away. You keep your freedom. You keep what's left. Or you don't. And within 48 hours I destroy everything you've built. Not with my people. With the FBI." Paxton stared at him, trying to read whether he was bluffing or telling the truth. But Rowan Kessler isn't a man who bluffs. He's a man who does exactly what he says, and that's more frightening than any threat. While Paxton stood there, weighing his options, behind the warehouse, Beckett and 4 men had already entered through the back. They handled the 3 guards quickly and cleanly, without noise. Beckett opened the back room door and saw Josie sitting on a chair, eyes wide with fear but unharmed. "Josie Shaw. I'm Beckett. Your sisters sent me. Come with me." Josie hesitated for a second, then stood. Beckett led her out the back, into the car, and drove off. Rowan's phone vibrated once. A message from Beckett. "Josie is safe." Rowan glanced at it, then looked back at Paxton. "It's done," he said. "Her sister is out, and your evidence is already on its way to the FBI. I'm not waiting for your answer, because I don't actually need one." Rowan turned and walked out the front door. Paxton stood there, realizing he had lost, not just at the negotiation table, but on every front at once. 3 days later, the FBI opened a federal investigation into Paxton Hale's network. Assets were frozen. His people were summoned. 5 shell companies shut down. Paxton left Chicago before an arrest warrant could be issued. Along with the evidence against Paxton, Rowan also sent every message and record of communication between Felicity Grant and Paxton Hale. Felicity, who had provided internal information about the Kessler family, who had revealed Josie's location, who had aligned herself with an enemy to harm a 19-year-old girl waiting for heart surgery. Rowan didn't send Felicity's evidence to the FBI. He did something worse. He sent it to Chicago's high society. Everyone knew. The Grant family knew. Business partners knew. Friends knew. Within 1 week, Felicity Grant lost everything she had built through connections and reputation. Her family publicly disowned her to protect the Grant name. No one in that world answered her calls anymore. Felicity left Chicago that weekend, quietly, with no one there to see her off. Beckett took Josie straight back to Cook County Hospital. Maren was waiting in the emergency lobby, and when she saw her sister step out of the car, alive, still able to walk, still looking at her with those familiar eyes, she ran forward and wrapped her arms around Josie without being able to say a word. Josie hugged her back, her hands gripping tightly at the back of Maren's shirt, trembling slightly. "I'm okay," Josie whispered. "I'm okay, sis." Maren held her for a long moment, her face pressed into her sister's shoulder, before finally letting go. She checked her from head to toe, her hand touching her forehead, feeling her pulse, looking into her eyes to check her pupils. The habits of a nurse she couldn't let go of, even while she was crying. Josie let her do it, didn't complain. She knew that was how Maren said "I love you" without having to speak. The doctor examined Josie again, confirming she hadn't suffered any additional harm during the time she was held. Her cardiac indicators were still stable, and the surgery could proceed as scheduled. The doctor set the operation for the following morning. That night, Maren sat beside Josie's bed until she fell asleep. She held her hand, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, and felt as if something most precious had just been returned to her after nearly being lost. When Josie drifted off, Maren stepped into the hallway. Rowan was there, leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets. He hadn't gone into the room because he understood that moment belonged to the two sisters. It didn't need a third person. But he was here, just outside the door, from the moment Josie was brought back. Maren looked at him. "How long have you been standing here? Since you went in. Why didn't you go home?" "Because you haven't gone home." Maren didn't say anything else. She sat down on the row of chairs in the hallway, and Rowan sat beside her. The hospital corridor at midnight was quiet and still, filled only with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of a nurse's footsteps passing by. They sat together without speaking, just like the night they sat outside the diner on Halsted Street. But it was different, because that night, Maren was falling apart, and this time, she was being put back together. After a while, Rowan stood, walked off somewhere, then returned with 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine at the end of the hall. He handed one to Maren, sat down, and drank the other. Machine coffee, hot but thin, the kind Rowan Kessler probably had never touched in his everyday life. But he drank it without a frown, without a comment. Maren held the cup, the warmth settling into her palms. She glanced at Rowan, at the man sitting on a plastic hospital chair in dark clothes, drinking vending machine coffee, waiting for the surgery of an unemployed nurse's sister, and she thought that this was when he looked most like an ordinary man. Not when he stood on a stage at a charity event, not when he faced Paxton in a warehouse, but here, sitting quietly, drinking bad coffee, waiting with her. They sat through the night. Sometimes Maren drifted into brief sleep, her head tilting to one side, then she would start awake. Every time she opened her eyes, Rowan was still there, in the same place, in the same posture. He didn't sleep. Early the next morning, Josie was taken into surgery. Maren stood outside the operating room, looking through the small glass window, seeing her sister lying on the table, eyes closed, her chest rising and falling steadily with the ventilator. She stood there without moving, her hands clenched tightly in front of her chest. Rowan stood behind her, didn't speak, didn't touch her, just there. The surgery lasted more than 4 hours. 4 hours that Maren counted minute by minute. She didn't sit, didn't eat, didn't drink anything except the coffee Rowan had given her at midnight. She just stood and waited, as if stepping away from that door would make everything collapse. Then the door opened. The doctor stepped out, removed his mask, and looked at Maren. The surgery was successful. Her heart responded very well. She'll need a few days of monitoring, but the prognosis is very good. Maren stood still. She heard every word, understood every word, but it took a few seconds for them to truly sink in. Then she turned to Rowan. She didn't speak. She simply reached out and took his hand. The first time Maren Shaw had ever touched Rowan Kessler on her own, not for first aid, not out of professional instinct. Just her, holding his hand because she wanted to. Rowan looked down at her hand in his, then back at her face. He didn't say anything. He just held on. That afternoon, Josie woke in the recovery room. Maren sat beside her, holding her hand, smiling without effort. Josie opened her eyes, looked at her sister, her voice weak but still strong enough to speak. "Did you cry?" "No. Your eyes are red. That's from not sleeping." Josie smiled faintly, weak but real. Just then, the door opened. Constance Kessler walked in, her back still straight, her silver hair neatly tied. But in her hands she carried a bag of food. Not takeout, home-cooked food, placed in glass containers, wrapped in cloth. She set the bag on the table beside Josie's bed, then looked at Marin. She didn't say sorry again. She didn't say thank you again. She simply set the food down and said briefly, "Chicken porridge. Good for someone after surgery. I made it this morning." Then she nodded to Josie, nodded to Marin, and walked out. Marin looked at the bag on the table. Chicken porridge, cooked at home by Constance Kessler, a woman who had spent 15 years in a mansion with private chefs, a woman who had once thrown a suitcase of money at her feet. She had cooked it herself, brought it herself, placed it on the table herself. It wasn't an apology. It was something greater than an apology. Josie looked at the bag, then at her sister. "Who was that?" "Someone I know," Marin said. Josie studied her, noticing that the dark circles under her sister's eyes weren't as heavy as they had been weeks before, noticing the smile on her face. A real smile, not forced, and she said softly, but clearly, "You're not pretending anymore, are you? This time you're really not tired." Marin looked at her, remembering the last time she sat beside this bed, when Josie had said, "You're not good at lying." Back then she had been hiding everything, hiding the exhaustion, hiding the worry about hospital bills, hiding the night in the dark alley. Now, for the first time, she didn't have to hide anything. "Yeah," Marin said, holding her sister's hand. "This time I'm not pretending." 3 months later, Marin Shaw put on her white coat again. Not at St. Michael Hospital, not at any hospital that had once closed its doors to her, but at the new hospital owned by the Kessler Group, a place Rowan didn't open because he needed another investment, but because he knew this city needed another place where people like Marin could do the work they were meant to do. On her first morning back, Marin arrived early. The corridors were still quiet, early sunlight filtering through glass windows, the faint scent of fresh paint lingering in the air. She stepped into the nurse's station, set down her bag, and saw a cup of coffee still warm on her desk. Steam rose gently in the morning light. Beside it lay a small folded note, the handwriting brief and direct. "Don't forget to eat lunch," signed with a single letter. Marin picked up the note. She looked at the handwriting, the kind of writing from someone who isn't good with sweet words, who doesn't write long messages, but who is always there at exactly the moment she needs him. She remembered the glass of water she once ordered for him at that small diner, when he sat among plastic tables and chairs in a tailored suit, looking for the first time like an ordinary man. She remembered the cup of coffee he handed her at midnight outside the operating room, vending machine coffee, hot but thin, that he drank without even a frown. And now this cup, sitting on her desk, on the first morning she returned to being a nurse. Marin smiled, folded the note, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat, right above her heart. Josie had been discharged, recovering well, now at home finishing the book she had bought from the bookstore on Wells Street. Constance Kessler was no longer an enemy. She was still cold, still proud, still never good at apologizing, but she had cooked chicken porridge with her own hands and brought it to the hospital, and sometimes small actions like that say more than any apology in the world. And Rowan, he was still Rowan Kessler, the man half of Chicago fears, and the other half doesn't dare to name. He still isn't good with sweet words, still rarely smiles, still makes decisions with a cold voice and a sharp gaze. But he is always there, outside an operating room at midnight, in a small diner at 12 o'clock, on the sidewalk behind a late-night restaurant on Halsted Street, and now, in the warmth of a cup of coffee, waiting on her desk every morning. Marin Shaw slipped the note into her pocket, lifted the coffee, took a sip, and began her first day back at work. If Marin's story has touched you, please tap like to support us, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. We'd truly like to know how this story made you feel. Please leave a comment and share what's in your heart. We read every line and appreciate every word. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.
Cesar? NECA? All really fucking amazing artists. Welcome in, Spanner. Hi, Tartan. Hi, Nix. Hi, Mercy. Gouache always sounds like it ought to be a made-up word. I pronounced it gauche the whole time. Galacticat! I love Galacticat. Rara! I know Rara too. These are all amazing artists, by the way. Painter is so amazing. How gauche. And no, no alien isolation tonight. No, we celebrated 5,000 followers last Saturday, and I played Alien Isolation, which is a pants shittingly scary game for me. MIDI, yes. I've been to Joshua Tree a few times. I took this photo, actually. This is from a photo that I took in Joshua Tree. I've been there a bunch of times. I actually drove through there just a few weeks ago. Jacqueline's great background art vibes. Yeah, Galacticat is amazing. Nothing like paying money to suffer and cry. Yep, 40 good American dollars. To just, oh God.